Hello. Ever wondered about the different forms, shape of water and energy water can take? The relationship between drinking water and our city life, another question mark. Here we are with Jane Withers, an internationally acclaimed designer and curator, raising some of the most pertinent questions the world needs to ask if we are to protect both water as well as our society. Something remarkable about her work is the element of design through which she aims to inspire conversations around critical issues of sustainable sanitation, circularity, and nature-based system. The value of rain and how traditional practices are once again informing our contemporary approaches. Our master speaker today, Jane Withers, is a leading curator and design consultant. Her London-based studio works with global brands and institutions on design-led strategies. She has curated critically acclaimed exhibitions and programs at the Victoria and Albert Museum and Royal Academy of Arts, amongst many other internationally. Accolades, yes. An honorary fellowship by the University of Westminster for services to the environment, and recently Milan's Design Prize for experimentation. All this at the Digital Arts Forum, our design and arts community that is committed to lead the change for the next epoch as we find ourselves at the intersection of technology, art, science, sustainability, and design. It covers all forms of digital design and art, from fashion design to virtual reality to architecture. Let's talk about the contribution made by water to the cities. As integral to this, digital arts community is Forum Days. Welcome to the most happening weekday seminars for the creative community. Master speakers from across the world share insights on the cutting edge of design and technology. Simply put, the idea is to generate collaborative knowledge and projects that span multiple disciplines catalyzed by this new thinking and knowledge. Here's an opportunity to learn, interact, share, and discover. With this, I now request Deepak to run the introduction AV. Listen in as she illustrates a completely fresh narrative around water and culture through her projects such as Waterloop, Wonder Water Cafe, and Water Futures. Ladies and gentlemen, Jane Withers. Jane, you are muted.
Sorry. I think, is that better?
Yes, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you. And thank you for the very kind words of introduction. As Dr. Gusharan explained, I have a curatorial practice based in London. I'm a design historian by training. We work across museums, institutions, brands, companies on a very varied range of projects. At the moment, we're working on an exhibition on waste for the Design Museum. We're working on a project reimagining death rituals and another on a post-pandemic, or rather living with pandemic, view of well-being in interiors. But I think what all our work has in common is this view of design as a strategy for positive impact, the belief that it can be imaginatively involved in societal change and help us negotiate the future in a face of extremely deep social, political, economic, and environmental uncertainty. The pandemic, of course, has heightened this, and it's sharpened our focus on what we think is really important. And as Gershon explained, today I'm going to focus on water. This subject has been a constant in our work for well over a decade, and a sort of personal obsession for much longer, for as long as I can remember. And in the last decade, we've become really interested in the roles designers can play in solving the global water crisis. We all know how imminent it is. Well, we all know how grave it is. Demand for fresh water is expected to exceed supply by 40% by 2030. And one of the things we've become aware of is that so many of the ways the current systems treat water are no longer appropriate for the future. And we need to approach it really imaginatively. We've seen how centralized systems are failing in Cape Town, the droughts in Chennai, all over the world. So we need new practical solutions, but we also need a new water culture, a new belief in it. We sort of lost what might be called a water wisdom. We need to revalue it and reconnect with it. A thinker that I'm particularly enthused by is Ivan Illich and his little short essay on water, when he talks as though we turned it into an industrialized fluid that we no longer care about. And of course, this depends where we are in the world, but I think we have lost a lot of the ancient wisdoms around water. And I think this is something that we very much believe is appropriate for the future. I'm going to show you 3 projects today. The first looks at sustainable sanitation. The second focuses on water and food. And the third is really Water Futures and Education Programme. So this is Loo Cafe Waterloop, the first project. It was almost a year ago, I visited Hyderabad. I was invited by Indian Design Forum and the British Council. And they asked us to make a project, and we really came around water. We came with very little preconception, but met a rather extraordinary man, Mr. Abhishek Nath of Ixora Corporate Services. And he had started in Hyderabad a project called Loo Cafe, luxury washroom. I think there were at that time about 10 or 15 in the city, a container-based project for a free public toilet, which is supported by the cafe kiosk. And it seemed like a sort of clever idea that was already proven as a concept to work, very simple and doable, but perhaps the architecture and the sort of notion of sustainability could be improved. So with the help of the British Council and Telangana government, we began looking at making a new concept, which we presented last October at Hyderabad Design Week. And so instead of Loo Cafe, it became Loo Cafe Waterloop. And the idea was to make a project with a similar program of washrooms and cafe and social space, but to make the building as a model, a demonstrable model for sustainable sanitation that would celebrate water loop and circular systems. So we collaborated with an architect, Anupama Kundu, who's based between Oroville and Berlin, and has a long history working in sustainable design, in particular in social housing and public toilets. So her experience was vital to this, and also, which we'll come to a bit later, building with communities in ferro cement. So the building is essentially, Anupama's idea was to take the model of a gas station, because these are roadside buildings that are really all about the roof, but use it for the cafe and toilet instead. So you have this sort of celebratory roof that's all about collecting and channeling and storing rainwater. Like the original Loo Cafes, it's still robustly low cost, but it demonstrates rainwater harvesting, waterless urinals and dry toilets, composting, plastic-free, zero waste, and so on. And the idea was that it would be as much a sort of community social space as well as the functional public toilets, which we see here. And for the exhibition, we made a series of posters to explore the sustainability concepts we were looking at in Waterloop. And the first was Drink Rain, the emblem you see at the top. Catching, channeling, storing rainwater has been essential for communities for thousands of years. And there's a whole history of architecture from India's great step wells, Roman aqueducts and so on that celebrate the capture and transportation of water. But in the modern city, we largely let this free resource flow away. But rainwater, as I'm sure you're all, rain harvesting is beginning to be given a new focus as a vital resource and possibilities for the future, and also allied to issues such as runoff in the urban environment and the problems caused by this with increasing impervious tarmac surfaces and so on. So the structure of Loo Cafe is designed to capture the water and funnel it through the building, and the sort of celebration of this is a drinking fountain where you can drink filtered rainwater, and that's part of the raising awareness of the celebration of the rainwater. Another of the technologies we look at is urine harvesting. New toilets make it possible to capture phosphorus from urine. At the moment, we've got an excessive pollution of nitrogen caused by sewage and agricultural fertilizers. And so these new toilets can separate urine and capture the valuable nutrients, which are currently literally pissed away, and extract them, phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium for use as fertilizers. And interestingly, I think you can just see it on the diagram here, urine harvesting. An average P is 300 centiliters, and that gives 200 milligrams of phosphorus, which is enough to grow 3 carrots, which to me seems rather extraordinary, the amount of value in urine. And then we've got the third one is no flush. Toilets, as we know, in many parts of the world, we use drinking quality water to flush toilets, which is absolutely absurd. So this is looking instead at waterless toilets and the possibility of composting toilets, again, capturing the nutrients from human waste to make a circular system. And we went in more depth into Loop the Poop and the sort of history of using human waste as fertilizer. And in fact, I think we find that only 30% of the global population is currently served by plumbed sewerage. So how do we look at acceptable forms of composting toilets and introducing these? And it was, again, very much the idea with Waterloop Loo Cafe is that we celebrate this and introduce the sort of looping the poop into the food system in a responsible way. And the final element that we looked at, which is Wonderwater Cafe, which is a project we've done, I'll explain in more detail in a moment, but for a number of years, where we've looked at the water footprint of food. 90% of the world's water is used for food, and I'll explain more about the water footprint in a moment, but for one samosa, it takes, in Hyderabad, these figures were done locally, roughly 215 litres of water. And so the idea was that the Loo Cafe would have a menu which uses positive water footprints, and we show how we can use different grains to make a samosa with a lower water footprint. So really the idea of the whole project was should be a place for education about the possibility of sustainable water systems. They're planned in two sizes, small and medium. It's all built out of modular elements that can be locally made from ferro cement. It's a very low-tech method of building, which really can be done by the community. And you see the small one, small version and a medium version. We were hoping to build the first prototype in Hyderabad this year, but that looks as though won't be possible in the COVID situation. So instead, there will be a sort of one-to-one model being built as part of Anupama's Kundu's exhibition at Louisiana in Denmark, opening in October. And we hope to build on the project from that. And within the next couple of years, have a working prototype. And as I say, this project was initiated by India Design Forum and the British Council and Department of Telangana. We also, and with our partners in Ixora as a funder and the sort of providing the sites, we also work with all the water data with King's College in London. So I'm always fascinated by how many people it takes and how many, what a mixture of skill sets you need to engage in something like this. The next project I'd like to talk about began much earlier, first of all in 2011, and this is the water footprint project we're talking about, and it's really a sort of raising awareness project. Very early on when I was teaching about water in various design schools with design students, I realized there was a real lack of understanding. I mean, it's much better now, but a decade ago, of the issues we faced. So I started collaborating with water scientists and asking them, quite naive questions like, how might design help? And there's a wonderful Professor Tony Allen at King's in London who came up in the 1980s with the concept of the water footprint, which I think is something that's only beginning to be widely understood. And he said, look, that's the most critical in to understanding how we use the water footprint is absolutely critical to understanding how we use water resources going forward. He said you should really focus on food because it uses over 90% of the world's water. So we looked at how design might help explain it. And the first one was done in Beijing Design Week in 2011. And we called it Wonder Water Cafe, but how much water do you eat? And it was really to draw attention to the quantities of water being consumed in food, which I think very little of us, and certainly myself at that point, understand. So we looked at, just to explain the water footprint briefly, in school we all learn we use 100, 120, 150 litres of water a day, washing, drinking, all the direct household water use, all these direct uses of water. In China, it's 129 litres a day against the global average of 152 litres. But that's the direct water. When we talk about indirect water, the virtual water, a person per capita in China uses nearly 3,000 litres of water a day, which is pretty extraordinary, really. And this is for all the products, services, and particularly the food we consume. So we decided to sort of make a project that would go in this in a bit more detail, and in a way that we hoped in a design festival might capture people's imagination and make it a point of discussion. So we wanted to do it as a kind of live project in a restaurant, and we found this little restaurant in Dashala, which is one of the oldest districts in Beijing, near to the Forbidden City. And we found a very willing collaborator in the owner of Tianhai, who's very interested in environmental issues. And here we are inside the cafe. And the idea was it should be accessible, typical, local place, where we would be talking to local audiences as well as the Design Week audience. So we took Tianhai's menu and we tried to estimate working with Aalto University in Helsinki and also their department in Shanghai, looking at water consumption for the menu. And it was actually fabulously difficult because when the menu arrived, it had over 100 dishes on it. And each recipe has many ingredients in Chinese cuisine. So we had to sort of take just their most popular dishes. And we made our own little menu explaining water consumption. And I'll give you one of the recipes, hang a heat of roast duck. So it takes nearly 7,000 litres of water to raise a duck in the suburbs of Beijing. And that's largely on the feed given to the duck. It takes 120 litres of water for the oil, 40 for growing the spring onions and so on. But it's a staggering quantity. And we found it really surprised people and opened up a lot of discussions during the design week. For comparison, we looked at a seafood dish, much lower water footprint, under 2,000 litres, and a vegetarian one, again, much, much lower, so that we had some sort of comparisons for discussion. We marked the medium, low, medium, and high water footprints in the dishes and really used this as a kind of workshop around water and food. We've carried on doing this several times. We've done it subsequently in Helsinki, in London, and last year during Milan's Salone at the Triennale and the Broken Nature exhibition, which was an extraordinary exhibition looking at design and the future environment. And here we took the menu in the cafe and we focused on, it's a pizza cafe, and we looked at the water footprint of a margarita pizza, most standard thing. And we found that for this particular pizza, it takes 793 litres to make it. And it's kind of fascinating because you think of Italy as a company, as a country, they're very proud of their food and also very keen on locally grown foods and so on. But we found that the huge quantity of water went on both the buffalo mozzarella and also wheat, because a lot of that is imported from the US and irrigated. So it's always surprising to see the sort of what's behind these huge figures and how we could begin to look differently. And then that's just, we looked at dairy consumption, milk, and so on. So that's a project that we'll continue to do, but we're developing it in a slightly different direction. So rather than just showing the water footprint of existing menus, we're looking at low water footprint menus and trying to get restaurants the next time to adopt that, so we can explain how you can eat positively. And of course, it's an issue that's massively important for future food security, when we find in many countries so much of this water is imported from other places. So, in London, if I'm eating beans from Kenya, as well as asking how much water do you eat, you have to ask whose water you're eating, where's the local impact, and so on. And the third project I want to show you is something that we finished earlier this year. This is the catalogue from Water Futures, which was a year-long educational program at ADO, which is a design center in Brooklyn in New York. And for me, it was just a wonderful opportunity to be able to make a year-long program working with designers and leading institutions, as well as the team at ADO. We worked with Columbia's Water Center, with Parsons New School, and so on. So we could really bring together experts from different fields to explore how designers could address the water crisis. And really, it's all about, the way I see it, informing and inspiring designers. And we put together the most diverse of teams, depending on the issues we were looking at. Overall, there were about 30 events, talks, workshops, dinners, performances. We had an open call, and really about generating dialogue and new approaches to water. So we divided the year into 3 seasons, and I'll just show you a few excerpts from one, because I realize we haven't got that much time left. the three seasons were harvesting the sky, pollution and purification, and drink local. But I'll just show you, as we've been talking about rainwater, a little about harvesting the sky. We kicked off the season with a wonderful talk from Professor Mona Livingstone, who's another hero of mine, as she's studied many vernacular methods of ancient and vernacular methods of designing for water, and many which, with the low-tech movement, looking at vernacular design, many of these things are beginning to be relevant again. And I'm sure you'll all be familiar with step wells. I suppose these vernacular methods repurposed and rejuvenated to sort of generate sustainable climate resilient infrastructures in future. And she was talking in particular about step wells, and this is one in Gujarat, which is still very much in use and still has many of the customs around the local deities and so on. I think actually this is a stepped pond in particularly. So her talk was all about opening up the possibility for re-engaging with natural water cycles, rainwater collection, and so on. And then we started to look at our own projects with contemporary architects and designers. And Ooze are some architects based in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and they're looking at reintroducing natural cycles in the urban environment. And they compared rainfall in 3 cities, in Rio, New York, and Chennai, comparative quantities, the potential for rainwater collection, and how that could be married to consumption per capita. So we're going to look at a scheme they proposed for Chennai, looking at the use for one person in Chennai, current use, and what could be done with rainwater collection. And at the moment, what happens to wastewater, which is largely fed into polluting the Bay of Bengal. So the proposal that they've come up with, working with the Dutch government in Chennai, is actually being trialled at the moment. It's called City of 1,000 Tanks. And the idea is to restore existing temple tanks and link them together with bioswales, so that instead of the current situation where water flows off, I think 60% of plus is tarmacked of the city, and water flows directly into the sea, to capture the rainwater and hold it in these tanks, and be able to clean wastewater within the city. And the first pilot is happening at the moment. So I think it's a very exciting, completely different approach to the future from the current centralized systems. And then we looked also at collecting moisture from the air, and the history of this in the sort of latter part of the 20th century in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And I think this is one of the largest projects today for another area where there's huge potential. I think there's 6-7 times more moisture in the air than there are in all the Earth's rivers. So how you capture it in an environmentally sustainable, passive way is really interesting. And there've been collection going back to Byzantine air wells, fog catchers go back to the Inca Empire. And I think this is one of the largest current projects in the world in Morocco, which I think feeds about 140 families in the Anti-Atlas. And this is a designer's version on this, originally made for towers for Ethiopia. An architect, and Vittori came and held a workshop about meshes for fog catching and so on in Brooklyn. And showing how they've experimented with many different forms. And the idea is very much put it as sort of center of the village in villages in, I think, Africa initially, but in Ethiopia. but how this could be used as a sort of celebratory structure. And I think it's something that's very much in development at the moment, but the workshop raised a lot of interesting issues. And then finally, we worked with Studio Swine to look at how similar ideas might be interpreted in an urban environment. And you'll all be familiar with the iconic water towers, the wooden structures on top of New York towers. And it's sort of, they pointed out that it seems crazy that those are all about storing storing water for use within the buildings, but they don't capture it. So what if they could become water towers that capture and clean water as well? So this was a proposal by designers Studio Swine for capturing, storing and filtering water on site. Very much about raising awareness of the rain issue again. And so I think that what I'm aiming to show here is how we use a year-long platform like Water Futures to engage with designers and push as much dialogue and discussion and new ideas as we can, and are very much about the process and the dissemination of these ideas. And we've made a catalogue, the one I showed you here, the Water Futures catalogue, which is all about capturing this both digitally and as a physical catalogue to share with other design schools around the world. And we're very much hoping to embark early next year on Water Futures Mark II. It's a program we want to keep going. And I think that probably takes us to the end of our time and question time. So thank you very much for listening.
Well, Jane, I think this was one of the absolutely phenomenal presentation that we have had. It's really, really impressive. And to talk about, various geographies, bringing in a perspective from Chile, from US, from India, from China, and amazing, revelations by way of saying that, a simple margarita pizza would consume almost 793 liters of water. It's unimaginable. And from 129 liters a day directly going up to almost 3,000 liters of water consumption on an average, across. So it's really, really, a very deep study on the water futures, which is what you presented. I'm really thankful to you, and I congratulate you for making this presentation to our audiences. Excellent. At this moment, let me bring in our experts. We are joined by Dr. M. Ramachandran. He was the former Secretary of Urban Development, Government of India, and is a leading expert and voice and an opinion leader on cities. We have Professor Thomas Michael with us, who is Dean of School of Art and Architecture from O.P. Jindal Global University and a Harvard alumni. And we also have Ms. Shneel Malik. She's also joining in for London. She is an architect as well as a biodesigner. Welcome to all three of you experts on the panel. Before I invite Dr. Ramachandran, I request Deepak to run a small video clip, which is actually on one aspect of what Jane, you talked about, drinking the rains. So this is about catching the rains. Deepak, can you run the video?
We need to look at all possible sources of conserving water and making it available to people. There are two important points in this regard. One is that of catching the rain where it falls and storing it. The other is that of protecting all the water bodies which we have in our cities and towns. It may be recalled years back when the National Urban Renewal Mission was launched. One of the reform measures to be taken up by the participating cities, towns, local bodies was that of modifying the bylaws to provide for rainwater harvesting provisions in all the buildings of the cities and towns. Some cities and towns bodies did it, There are many more which still need to do it. We have over 4,000 urban local bodies in the country. So the message has to reach out to all the 4,000 plus urban local bodies so that every city and town is conscious of this program, conscious of this mission and the importance of this mission, because this is a service which we can do not only to our generation but also to the future generation by making use of water, which is the nature's gift for our purposes.
So with this, I invite Dr. Ramachandran for your comments as well as inputs.
Thank you, Gurshavan, and thank you for highlighting that water mission message. I deliberately chose to stand in the park, and someone was later commenting that with all those birds, these days birds have a gala time because there is less pollution, less noise, less activity. It was more appropriate to be in the midst of nature, emphasizing the importance of water. What Jane has talked about, I bring in another dimension of the entire discussion. As Gurshan mentioned, I work in the urban field, so I tend to look at it more from the point of view of how much of water is available to people to drink, or what is the access. It's another matter going beyond the normal water which we drink. There are other forms of consuming water which, as highlighted, also becomes important. So just for those who want to have a basic idea, 4% of world water is what we have, with some 17% of the world's population in our country. 3.6 million kilometers of length of river network we have in our country. And those who are India observers would have heard any number of times about linking the rivers to take better advantage of the water available. And globally, although water covers 70% of the earth, only 1% of Earth's water is available for drinking purposes. So that is the broader scenario. And when it comes to per capita water availability, India ranks at 132, which shows where we are. We have average rainfall of 1,160 millimeters. Our per capita availability of water, if it was 16 cubic meters in 2001, 10 years later, it became 1508, and it's expected to come down to 1486 cubic meters in 2021. That is by the time we have our next census. We are the highest extractors of groundwater. Probably are all familiar, we have census every 10 years. We have the last census in 2011. That census shows that 71.2% of urban households had access to drinking water within their premises. And that's what is important. And moving on, another 8% had to go beyond 100 meters to fetch their drinking water. And the one in between, they had it within their 100-meter range. So the broader issues regarding drinking water in our cities are inadequate coverage, intermittent supplies, low pressure, poor quality. Continuing with what the main speaker said, we have water ATMs in some places, more so in the south. Collecting moisture from the air is something which really has to become popular. Since Jane has worked with Chennai, she is familiar probably with the desalination project which we have. It's an expensive proposition as far as Chennai is concerned. So there is a mission now of the government of India which aims at providing water tap connection to every household by the year 2024, which means reaching out to some 146 million rural households which do not have tap water coverage. And there was a time when we talked about when women from the rural areas had to walk kilometers to fetch firewood for basic cooking purposes. Now it has changed with gas becoming available. Similarly, for water also, especially women have to travel long distances. The idea is to get out of that scenario. It's called what is called a Jal Jeevan mission. The problem with our cities is we have no idea as to what is the requirement of water for each city and how are we planning for that requirement 5 years from now, 10 years from now. since the water mission reference has come in, I shall very briefly touch upon what it is about. It is one of the 8 missions of the Government of India to deal with the impact of climate change. And its objective is conservation of water, minimizing wastage, ensuring more equitable distribution. Though we talk about water in very many senses, but we still do not seem to realize the significance of water we are wasting. And water wasted in cities could easily come to a total of 50% of the total availability in some cities. That is something which we have to address in a very focused manner. So this mission has broadly 5 goals. One is comprehensive water database in public domain. There isn't the required awareness as far as city residents are concerned. So data relating to water has to be available in the public domain. How much am I wasting? Where is it coming from? How much are we spending on getting that water and things like that. Then promotion of citizen and state actions for water conservation, which includes empowerment of urban local bodies as far as urban areas are concerned and the village panchayats in the rural areas. Focused attention to vulnerable areas, which will include promotion of traditional system of water conservation, something which we have ignored over a period of time. Systematic approach for coping with floods. That's also something which is on the agenda as far as the mission is concerned. Then increasing water use efficiency by 20%. Now, these are all stated nationally, but it has to travel down to the operative level when it comes to implementation. So incentivizing recycling of water, improving efficiency of urban water supply system. There is much that can be done. Promote water regulatory authorities so that there is some sort of discipline brought about in our cities. Promote mandatory water audit, something which we do not take very seriously. And also another goal is promotion of basin level integrated water resources management, guidelines for different uses of water, including drinking water. So a certain discipline is adhered to. That's about the mission, since there is a beginning like that. At the moment, the mission is focusing on catch the rain where it falls. And that's something which cities have been trying to do, but not all across the country in the 4,000 plus cities and towns which we have. So what has happened is river water harvesting was made mandatory in all buildings in some places, recharge, direct use, and including it in the building bylaws. That is what the urban local bodies are supposed to do. And if they want to incentivize, they can give rebate in property tax. So some states, including the reference came to Tamil Nadu, had taken some steps. Kerala introduced this provision in the municipality rules in 1999. Madhya Pradesh did it in July 2004. Hyderabad did it in 2001. It was made mandatory rainwater harvesting on all buildings. Tamil Nadu did it in 2002. The other states like Maharashtra, Gujarat, etc., which have also done this. But this is making a provision. It's a question of implementing and having an idea as to how much rainwater is it which I get in my city and which I can use and I'm making use of. There is no definite data available about these things. Karnataka Urban Water Drinking and Sanitation Policy 2002 also referred to this. So there are references to this. 24/7 water supply is another area we are trying to work in a very limited manner. Nagpur is one city which has taken up. And as far as Nagpur is concerned, their non-revenue water was as high as 62% when they started this process. So that is the taking on from the main speaker, the respect we have for water, or the due regard we give to water. So 62% becoming non-revenue water, which is for which there is no revenue realized. I mean, we never seem to bother about that. So when the city Nagpur's figures are looked at, 625 million liters of raw water is, becomes available to the municipal corporation, but only 241 million liters are assessed and billed. So 625 is availability, only 241 is bill, million liters. Where does the balance go and who is responsible for that? Mm-hmm. That is the issue as far as our cities are concerned.
Yeah.
So as far as our cities are concerned,
so we are a little short on time, so if you could conclude.
yeah, I'm concluding. So there are various aspects of the water-related issue to be addressed. As far as riverfront development is concerned, there have been beginnings here and there. Sabarmati riverfront development in Ahmedabad, Nagpur. These are some isolated initiatives where people have been sensitized about the importance of river and water. So I've touched upon the city drinking water issues, the importance of water bodies in our cities, and how people have to learn to respect that, for which how the systems have to come into play. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. This was another aspect on the water. First, we had the design part of it and whether to drink water or to eat water, and look at that aspect. Dr. Ramachandran brought in the perspective of the urban development in cities as to what is it that needs to be done. So, since water happens to be an integral part of all kinds of design and architectures, and here is it, I invite Professor Thomas, an architect.
All right, I will keep this very focused. Thank you, Jane, for that presentation. As a designer, I can see a lot of different types of knowledge systems have been integrated. At the beginning, you talked a little bit about some of the archaic and other forms of knowledge, and the presentations obviously leaned on something that combined often high tech and low tech, which I think is fascinating and offers a lot of opportunities for future development too. I note that there's a reference to the bodies and the pleasure of water, the health and hygiene associations with it as well. And it also reminds me that there's other types of knowledge that we can still be exploring. When I was a young student, they were just starting to study not just embodied energy, but the footprint of energy. How much energy does it cost to ship marble tiles to put on a skyscraper in New York from Italy, or zero carbon lifestyle where you start to do diagnoses. So using the empirical support for things that often might be mythopoetic or sensual seems like a very interesting way to bring different knowledge systems together. My question is going to be more open-ended though. You mentioned a couple times the different designers coming mostly from universities and the diverse teams that you used. And I guess it's a little bit of a question too in terms of the guidance system you use. When you've got different knowledge systems and expertise all dealing with a wicked problem such as water security, how do you wrangle all of the experts?
Please unmute yourself.
Sorry, yes, sorry, I just realized. Wrangle is a good word. It's often quite a formidable task, but actually we've interestingly found that if we engage people who are passionate, you know, sometimes I write to 10, 15 people before I found somebody like Dr. Ukmanu Lal, who leads the Water Center at Columbia University. And he was funny, he said, yeah, I think we can play with designers. I think this is going to be really interesting and our students will like it. And they have something like a group of water angels or something, which are across Columbia. So he brought them in. And I think we tend to do it. When we've done it officially, we find it quite slow. So we tend to do it by throwing things open, inviting people we know. I think also ADO, which is a design center, or sadly was, because it was only open for a 3-year program in Manhattan, it kind of provides, it's able to be quite relatively light-footed and cut across different institutions because it's not tied to one or the other. And I find that actually the easiest way. Similarly, when we're doing the water footprint, I mean, we talked to a number of people and some weren't, you know, very much wanted the water footprint to remain within the sort of academic fortress, and others like Tony Allen thought it was really interesting if consumers began to understand it and you made it a more open debate. So, you know, it really depends. We just sort of try people when we find like-minded people, and similarly with the designers, you know, and I think, you know, there's room for all sorts. So it's kind of, and similarly working with Schneel and BioID and the Bartlett, that's also been very interesting to find people who are enthused by this approach, really.
Yeah. So it sounds a little bit like getting a band together and improvising and finding who can play and who can't too.
Very good analogy, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's an interesting conversation we are having. Let me now invite a practitioner. So we have an architect and a biodesigner amongst us, Schneel Malik.
Thank you so much, Jane. It was absolutely brilliant. I actually keep it short. It seems like there is an effort of democratizing access to water, where one is how do we conserve and respect what we already have, as opposed to how we can make more, right? And there is a lot to do with culture and behavioral practices that are inculcated a lot in the designs that you showed, but also what Dr. Ramachandran was mentioning with the mission, the National Water Mission in India.
Mm-hmm.
But before that, actually, I was curious to ask you if there are certain myths that exist in the society about water and how we consume or access it, especially when it comes to how we mass produce a lot of consumer items that use a lot of, large amounts of water, but then they're sold as ethically sustainable. And that's actually a myth, because the amount of water that just is used to bring that duck onto your table so that you can consume it. So are there any interesting myths that you want to maybe highlight and share with us?
Myths around water. Well, I mean, some of my favorite ones. I think all the water stories or mythologies, they exist in all cultures. Everywhere has a flood myth, whether it's Noah, Japan, we're all warned about floods and droughts and so on, yet we're very surprised when they happen. And I think because we've forgotten quite a lot of them. So we try and bring back these stories, whether it's the dead passing from one side of the river to the other, to make people aware what a common water knowledge is there in every culture and how we can learn by keeping them alive. And one of my favorite ones are called tsunami stones in Japan. And when they had the tsunami, how many, 3-4 years ago, was it longer? There was a very interesting article in the New York Times which uncovered this system of tsunami stones which were built on the boundaries of floods 400-500 years ago to warn people where to build in the future. And the villages that had continued to practice and use those zonings weren't really affected by the tsunami, whereas ones where they transgressed were. So how do you hand down these stories is super interesting to me. That's one example.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful. We also have a few questions coming in. So let's take the first one by Anik Ray. What if desalination and purification of seawater could be done in a cost-effective manner? That water could be distributed to deep inland with the help of properly leveled up canals, just like the Egyptians did with the Nile, without spending energy for pumping out. Jane.
Well, of course, it would be fantastic if that could happen. I'm not a real expert on desalination, but as far as I know, we're very far from that in terms of cost. And you have all sorts of knock-on effects like what you do with the salt and so on. But there may be somebody on the panel who knows a bit more about desalination than I do, and particularly in relation to India. But I think my understanding is we're quite a long way from that situation at the moment.
Professor Michael, would you like to bring in a perspective to this particular aspect?
I have to unmute myself. I remember when I was in Australia that there was a strong emphasis on pursuing desalination. Australia technically was an urban country, meaning that 90% of the population lived within 6 of its coastal cities. And that meant that they could actually concentrate. And even under those conditions, running desalination plants to provide for the general economy was still cost prohibitive. There's also something interesting to think about too, because in the processes of having droughts and the famine that produced them, the scientists also found that there's a huge social cost for droughts as a consequence, and that there was greater incidence of domestic abuse, malnutrition, things that had 10-year-long consequences from one drought. So the water security issue shouldn't primarily be a financial consideration. You have to look at it much more holistically. If you use triple bottom line accounting, the decision-making should involve economics, but also social welfare and environmental. And when you start tabulating all of those things out, that might be the case that it could run a deficit for a while, but finding long-term sustainable solution around desalination. It also has to be part of a larger strategy around water security, water conservation, and an ethos of respecting maybe even the sacred that exists in water.
There is one question which is I would like to take live. There is an attendee called Tejashri Dahidar. So I am opening the channel for the person to talk and take the question. Can you go ahead and ask the question? We can hear you. Looks like we are not able to catch up on the person. Still on the mute. Well, we move on. And in fact, you know, there is a question as well as a suggestion. We all around the world, we are talking about saving water. But now when it is the pandemic situation, we are washing our hands at least 20 times a day. So how is it that given the current circumstances, can water still be saved? Open to anyone. Jane, probably we can start with.
Well, I mean, yes, I think, you know, in the pandemic, we've sort of forgotten lots of things. I mean, one that particularly distresses me is the crazy use of disposable plastic suddenly, for gloves, for absolutely everything, masks and so on. And you see them littering the streets in London, and people have stopped using, several states, I think, in America have outlawed reusable plastic bags. I mean, it's the same with the water situation. We can't just sort of drop environmental awareness because we're in this situation, and particularly because we're going to be living with it for some time. On the other hand, you know, it is perfectly possible to wash your hands with very small amounts of water, and for the field, you know, in the field, all sorts of things have been developed that use, I think, inverted plastic bottles that use a very small measure of water, one squeeze to wash your hands. So it's something well worth being aware of. But as we've seen, you know, there could be much bigger savings per capita in looking at where foods grow and what type of crops are grown and so on, compared to these for hand washing, I would imagine.
Well, thank you so much. Looks like we still have that person joining us, trying to ask the question, but not able to unmute himself or herself. So, but you know, given the time limitations, we already would have overshot by 15 minutes by everyone's time. Thank you. It's time to say goodbye. Jane, it's absolutely fantastic to, listening to your stories, Dr. M. Ramachandran, for bringing in that perspective from the cities as well as the Central Water Mission, Catching the Rain, Professor Michael, making it absolutely interesting from an academic as well as a practitioner's perspective, and adding on to that, Shneel Malik, which was very, very interesting. And Mr. Kochar, Samir Kochar, and Rohan Kochar, thank you very much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really been fun interacting with you all. Have a great day and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.